Just very briefly, we commissioned an expert survey as part of this research. As Kadir had mentioned, the option of doing a large-scale public opinion survey in the Gulf wasn't practical. YouGov actually told us that they couldn't ask the questions that you just saw presented. They couldn't ask those questions in any of the Gulf states. It was too sensitive, and I suspect they were also concerned that if they started doing research like that, it would blow back on them as well. So we commissioned an expert survey. We had 167 experts who were not randomly selected. They were experts that we reached out to, but roughly proportionate in terms of people in the region, people from the region, and then experts outside the region. And we asked them a series of questions about how they see economic aspects of inclusion or exclusion going forward, looking back to 2011, and where they see the major issues lying. And the general takeaways were that economic reform and unemployment are the most urgent policy issues facing governments in the Gulf, according to the experts that we surveyed. Progress is likely to be very limited if economic and political vested interests are not tackled, and not tackled successfully and at the same time. And I think we've seen over the past year in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman and the difficulty in pushing through some of his Vision 2030 ambitions. We've seen some of the strength of those vested interests pushing back. And of course we saw his attempt to try and engage with some of the economic elites with his anti-corruption campaign. In many ways a very populist move, partly because one of the questions in our survey asked people to rank corruption, perceived corruption, on a scale from 1 to 10, and it came out the majority of people ranked it between 7 and 8, so much more corrupt than less. There was also a desire for governments to become more responsive to citizen demands, which was also very interesting because they tried to take out the political aspect of it in terms of governments who tried to engage on economic issues, thinking that perhaps the political aspect wouldn't be as important. Think of Vision 2030 again, almost assuming a blank slate, a kind of tabula rasa in which to redraw the Saudi economy. But again, some of the questions we asked about how the changes in response to the austerity measures taken over the past 4 years, when oil prices began to fall, will change the relationship between the state and society. Many of the respondents indicated they would change the relationship with the state and that they expected the state to become much more transparent and accountable in response. States have become more responsive, but in selected areas, and again that came through in some of the surveys. Calling for greater transparency and accountability in state spending especially, and in also making state spending a much less opaque system whereby in many cases the state and the ruling family are one and the same. People calling for a much greater division between the two, especially if people are now being asked to contribute much more directly to state revenues. Effective and realistic tools of implementation are required to put the visions into practice. One of the criticisms perhaps of Vision 2030 and other visions is that they're just those, they're roadmaps, they're visions. Can you have a vision without a plan? And this, I think, has held back progress, but of course Saudi Arabia is just the latest in a whole series of countries in the Gulf to announced multi-decade visions. They began with Oman in 1995, and Oman's Vision 2020 has now almost run its course, so we can see from measuring a vision's stated objectives at the beginning and almost now reaching the end of its 25-year span, that some of the ambitions at the very beginning were very ambitious and have fallen far short. And obviously we're talking about 2030 in many cases. We won't be able to measure the ambition, the results of the visions for some time, but Oman gives a degree of insight into the gap between aspiration and reality. We asked about perceptions of freedom, security and equality in the GCC in the 6 years since the Arab Spring. We conducted the survey in May and June 2017, so immediately before the split in the Gulf as well. And overwhelmingly the respondents felt that freedom and security freedom especially has declined quite dramatically. Security to some extent has increased, and there's that trade-off between security at home and security abroad to some extent. But there is definitely a feeling that on personal freedom levels, the Gulf was going in a more negative direction. And I suspect that had we done the survey a year later, after 1 year of the Gulf crisis, that probably would have been accelerated, but perhaps also revealed some differences among the 6 Gulf states that may not have been as readily apparent prior to 2017. Again, going forward, I think some of the challenges that researchers who are looking at surveying the Gulf states will want to look at is how do respondents change across generations, for example. You know, we hear a lot about the 60% of youth in Saudi Arabia, for example, or in other Gulf states under the age of 30. Now, how do their aspirations, are they homogenous? Do they change according to background, class, position in society? Are they significantly different from the generations above them? I think trying to get a much more granular appreciation of how different groups in the Gulf perceive political, economic change, aspects of inclusion and exclusion could give us a very rounded out degree of insight into what may change in the future. Because of course, the visions and the plans in the Gulf are very top-down, and at some point they will have to meet bottom-up expectations of change, those bottom-up expectations that came so powerfully through in 2011 in other parts of the Middle East, and also there in Bahrain especially. But also in Kuwait you had very large-scale demonstrations in 2012. Even in Oman you had some demonstrations, and of course in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia as well. Inclusive and consensual processes of economic transition can be possible, but they're much more likely to succeed if they can be underpinned by gradual incremental political change that doesn't try and straitjacket and shoehorn the economic change into a rigid political system. And I think that hasn't yet caught up in some of the visions that we've seen. I mean, there is data-driven research going on in the Gulf states. We have in Qatar, for example, the Qatar Quarterly Survey. You have CESRI at Qatar University, the Social and Economic Survey Research Institute, which does a telephone survey that provides public opinion on questions of national interest to Qatar. In Kuwait, you have the RAI Institute for Strategic Studies and Research, and they publish an index every 2 months, which has a random telephone survey of Kuwaiti citizens to identify approval ratings for the National Assembly and for the government, and rank the 10 most important issues facing Kuwaiti citizens. There's also government ministries across the GCC that are doing private polling. And of course, that's not made public, and it's not intended for public consumption, but it's intended to better help ministries understand and appreciate the challenges they face. I remember being in Abu Dhabi in 2011, 2012, when there was a government ministry doing some very sensitive private polling on how different groups and communities within the UAE perceived each other and also perceived Emiratis, but to better understand some of the social challenges that may actually break out further down the line. And I think in Saudi Arabia, Vision 2030 is also being supported and underpinned by extensive private polling there as well. So there is clearly an appreciation on the part of authorities to better understand, using data, some of the policy challenges they're facing. Of course, the challenge for us is that a lot of it in the public domain is much more scattered and fragmented, and it's much more sensitive to any form of open research. But with that in mind, the full paper is outside. You can read this when you pick up a copy. And I'd like to pass over now to Karen Young, first of all, and then to Peter Salisbury afterwards.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around a little bit longer, and thanks to the Baker Institute and Carnegie for funding this project and leading it through for the last 2 years. It's been a lot of fun to work with this group, people I like and respect, so I hope we can continue the collaboration. As Christian said, we're really trying to think specifically about the Gulf in this group, and I'm going to talk about the paper that I wrote and kind of overview it for you, but it's really about experiments in fiscal governance. And I think, you know, we're often very negative about, of course, the political climate, about repression in the Gulf, but this is actually a really interesting moment for public policy, particularly economic policy. in which we're seeing true variance and experimental policy, trials of different ideas. And so just the openness to ideas of managing the relationship between state and economy specifically, I think is very hopeful, among the other things that are more difficult for us to understand right now. So I'm going to make 4 key points. First, on the structural barriers to economic reform and inclusion in the Gulf. The second, on jobs and the real employment crisis in the region. And third, on alternative sources of revenue, specifically debt. There's been a huge surge in debt finance in the last 3.5 years. And fourthly, on benefits and what it means to receive and expect social services and benefits from the state. And this is what many scholars are talking about, the renegotiation of the social contract in the Gulf, which is very real. And then I'll make 3 kind of general policy recommendations. So how do we get into this situation? Well, it's really about oil, as politics often are in the region. This is what has precipitated this torrent of fiscal policy changes. But it's across a range of reforms, from labor markets, financial sector liberalization, consumption and land tax, removal or reduction of subsidies on energy, water. And so it would be reasonable to expect that there could be some pushback, right? Some reconfiguration of state-society relations. But as yet, there have been very few signs of public unrest or protest, even with a really extremely high rising cost of living, particularly in Saudi Arabia, and the limited availability of public sector jobs, which has been the mainstay of citizen employment in the Gulf for more than 40 years. So how do we explain this puzzle, this muted reaction? Well, I think it's still very early. This is a short-term observation, and the shifts that are underway are truly structural. And it's not just for citizens. This is also, as society as a whole in the Gulf is in many places more foreign residents than citizens as part of the population. And this will take some time to fully absorb. And I think we're also seeing a real divergence in how society and citizenship are conceptualized by governments, and who is welcome and unwelcome. And some of the decisions and choices that are being made now about that inclusion, especially of foreigners, I think are going to have some very long-term repercussions that it's just too early to understand yet. So at the same time, there have been a number of changes at the regional and international levels, which have certainly seen a strengthening of authoritarian governance in the region and diminished incentives for risk-taking in civil society. And this is really the post-Arab Spring reality that continues to haunt the region. I think also more recently shifts in American politics and European politics after 2016 have reinforced negative perceptions of democratization, and certainly given rulers in the Gulf states an opportunity to promote their own visions of nationalist growth agendas and to avoid really a lot of external pressure on their methods of governance. So what we've seen since late 2014 with the decline of global oil prices is this period of policy experimentation in which the ends of a diversified economy, less reliant on oil, justifies the means of a radical break in a system of social welfare, changing employment preferences, and establishing a new role for the state and prescribing an agenda for growth. The issue for me, again, is about citizens and residents, how they react. Do they seize this as an opportunity? Do they exit? Exit voice loyalty, right? Or do they leave? And we're seeing mixed reactions across the Gulf. In Saudi Arabia, a lot of people are leaving. In Oman, a lot of people are leaving. And the way that governments respond to the welcoming or the unwelcoming environment, I think is very interesting. So first point on structural barriers to reform and economic growth. These are well established, and I think Kadir's survey bears out some other survey work that's been done. The World Bank had a very interesting report recently, Eruptions of Popular Anger, by the former chief economist from MENA, Elena Yanchovicina, sorry, I get it wrong, Bulgarian lady. She's wonderful, and the work that she and her colleagues did really showed a similar sense of prolonged and persistent grievances that motivated the Arab Spring are still there. And they do concentrate on economic issues, but also about economic mobility, the sense that you need to have connections to move forward, the importance of WASTA, And there's some interesting, she also has some very interesting data the World Bank does on economic inequality. It really isn't necessarily getting so worse overall region-wide, but it is getting worse in middle-income groups. So much like in American politics, there's been a squeeze in the region across the Middle East on that kind of middle class. And this is where the real sense of lack of mobility, lack of inclusion is so harsh. And that's true also in the Gulf, right? So people saying, young people, I play by the rules, I have a good degree, I went to school, and I can't find a job. I did everything right, you're not delivering to me as a government. And those perceptions and problems are persisting since 2011. So employment opportunities, lack of affordable housing are key structural issues which have not been alleviated. And we all know or are well aware of this is a generational issue, right? So the youth bulge wants to get married, wants to buy a home, wants to have a career. So this is very true in the Gulf, just as it is across the larger and wider region. Another kind of change, as I said, is the change in the perception of the value of foreigners as members of society and not just as economic actors. So we're seeing real shifts. This is in line with also the promotion of nationalist and patriotic agendas, which are very much state-driven across the GCC. We're seeing strong anti-migrant sentiment in Kuwait. Also in Saudi Arabia, just this week, were new rules rolled out restricting about 12 sectors to Saudi employment only, mostly in retail. And so, there's an economic reaction to that. Many small businesses are choosing to close, or they're trying to skirt the rules, keeping those foreign employees. But when the inspector comes in, I had a friend that sent me a message and said, you know what, they just pretend to be customers when the inspectors come. All right, so finding workaways. So there's two ways to look at it. That this is the imposition of the state on the economy and small businesses in particular in favor of nationalizing labor forces. It's interesting that the state will have to develop a more efficient bureaucracy to monitor progress in its new rules, so that could be a net positive. But in the short term, this is creating a lot of tension, particularly between business owners and the first face of the government, which is the inspector. So something to watch there. So all of the Gulf states aim to increase national employment in the private sector, but the prescriptions for how to do that are really different. So Saudi Arabia and Oman are increasing fees on hiring expats or making some sectors only available to national employment, while other states like Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE have made it easier to attract especially high-value talent. So extending rules for long-term visas, making it easier in Bahrain to transfer between employers. So a real question of the traditional kafala system, and also of the other real structural barrier to economic inclusion in the GCC, which has been the commercial agency structure, which means you have to have a local partner in order to start a franchise or a business. And these rules, which are 40, 50 years old, are really being demolished, which, from a liberal economic perspective is positive. But it puts increasing tension on that divide between national and non-national. The second point is on jobs, same kind of issue. The people that are leaving in the experimental Saudi project, 700,000 jobs were lost between the end of 2017 and second quarter of 2018. And these were largely low-wage jobs, mostly in construction. Maybe 10% of that in manufacturing. The general view is the Saudis are not taking these jobs, right? So while the government policy priority is to create jobs for nationals, the jobs that they are actually losing, that are opening up potentially for the national labor force, are not jobs that nationals are going to take. So this is a big mismatch. There's been a number of subsidy reforms which are interesting in that life is getting tougher and more expensive. In Saudi Arabia, we've seen a 2- to 3-fold increase in energy prices, more than 100% increase in gasoline prices in 2017. And this adds to this, in Saudi Arabia, there are lots of reasons for this, including the purge, the corruption purge in November last year. But there's very much a wait-and-see approach to the business environment, which is exactly what you don't need if you're trying to incentivize growth. So this whole diversification effort, which has been prompted since 2014, has had these kind of hiccups and stops and starts. And it's been very difficult to convince the local business community, citizens especially, owners of small business and large businesses, that things are moving in a positive direction. And so this is obviously a problem for the state, and as Christian mentioned, in Saudi Arabia, the government has been very actively pursuing a number of consumer surveys and population surveys on how people feel about the reforms, are they positive or negative. And it's good, it shows governments are listening, that they're sensitive, but we've also seen a lot of backtracking. And this is not good for a reform agenda when people can't be sure that this time the government means it, right? So we've seen backtracking on reinstatement of public bonuses, of salary numbers, of things like this. So the kind of lack of continuity has been somewhat of a problem. Yeah, we talked about people leaving. A third issue is the experimental fiscal policy, and really a heavy reliance on debt issuance to continue spending. So one of the kind of ironies of the current economic reform agenda is that public spending hasn't really decreased. So the 2018 Saudi budget is the largest budget that they've ever released. It's true that they have started releasing budgets, so there is more information available about government spending in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, which has been quite new. But it's not austerity, right? So the government is moving around how it spends. Military spending remains quite high. There's been some reduction in the public wage bill, but nothing to what the IMF and many economic advisors would recommend. And the question becomes, do we see a debt crisis in the Gulf in the next 10, 20 years? No, not on the way that we saw a debt crisis in the 1980s in Latin America. Certainly nothing like that. But it creates restrictions in the future of how governments will make fiscal policy. That sounds really boring, but it's really important. Because if 60–70% of your budget is currently the public sector wage bill, and you're reticent to cut that, and all of a sudden you've issued $150 billion worth of bond issuance across the GCC in the last 3 years. That starts being due in 7 years, and 10 years, and 20 years, and 30 years, and those repayments take a significant chunk out of your ability to spend on an annual basis. And so for Saudi Arabia, this is a bit more manageable. They have a lot of foreign reserve assets, etc. For Oman and Bahrain, this is much more difficult. And so we will see, again, variation in governments' spending habits and harder choices on where to devote spending towards education, towards healthcare, towards the large infrastructure investment that they've been doing over the last 20 years. Those choices are going to be harder to make, and they're going to be more reliant on outside funding to be able to do that. What does that mean in politics? It means that we're seeing the introduction of external players in ways that were not in the Gulf in economic policy before. In Oman, this means lots of loans from the Chinese government. In Saudi Arabia, this means loans from many large international commercial banks. The PIF, the Public Investment Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi, borrowed $11 billion this week. What is a sovereign wealth fund doing borrowing $11 billion, right, in order to spend it domestically? These are interesting choices in public finance, which did not exist a couple of years ago. For weaker economies, particularly Bahrain, they remain very dependent on support from the neighbors. So the Bahrainis currently in their central bank have enough reserve cover for about a month and a half of imports. That's a really, really low number. So they will need and expect to receive a deposit into their central bank from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and UAE. These states have said, yes, it's coming, but they haven't given a number. And so what does this do for Bahrain, who is basically debt financing their spending right now? It means they can't get a loan. It means they can't issue a bond. Because markets are saying, well, we want to know how much the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to give you before we're able to really price how risky it is to lend to you. And so there was a failed bond issuance effort in Bahrain just a few months ago, they are, I think on pins and needles waiting to see what that number of support will be. In terms of cutting back benefits, the kind of fourth issue, housing, as I mentioned, is incredibly important. There have been programs to try cash transfer schemes, which are very popular now in recommendations from international financial institutions. The problem is we don't have income tax, so it's very hard to know who is most in need. In Oman, they're doing this with a gas card, so basically to help families with the rising cost of fuel. In Saudi Arabia, it's called the Citizens Account. And most people are getting about $300 a month. And many, many more people, millions more, applied for the benefit than the government was expecting. So the monthly transfer is lower than anticipated. Let me end with the 3 policy recommendations that I make in the brief. Certainly economic inclusion in the Gulf states is a public policy priority. In housing, employment opportunities, governments are having to be more innovative in their policy choices, either mandating hiring of nationals or finding ways to incentivize foreigners to grow new businesses. And I think how society responds is very much an open question. 3 ideas or policy recommendations. The first is that governments should carefully balance short-term labor market challenges, especially among young adult populations, with a long-term need for diversification and growth. So immigration policy that welcomes foreigners with skills that can be transferred and taught, as well as resources that can be used to grow new businesses, will be essential. Low foreign wage workers can be useful, but should be granted some flexibility to move between employers so that the employers can also capture savings of having a more mobile workforce. The second one, reforms need staying power, and I mentioned this. Governments need to build credibility in their reform agenda. Backtracking or reinstating benefits will only make the transition to reduce subsidies more difficult for citizens to bear and to anticipate. And the last one, as a policy recommendation for working with citizen groups or worker organizations where they are permitted. There are some unions in Bahrain. And most importantly, for industry associations. The Gulf states need to keep in mind that there is power in transparency. It is not common to see industry groups across the GCC, but some are emerging. There are renewable energy groups in the UAE. It's very hard to get a license as a civil society, so you're treated kind of the same whether you are a charity supporting refugees in Syria or whether you are an industry group of lawyers. So governments could do well to differentiate more their perception of risk of basically citizens and expatriates getting together to lobby for their interest. I think the recent release of budgets by Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular will encourage some dialogue and shared planning between the private sector and the state. So those are just some short takeaways from the work that I've been doing on this project and others, and welcome your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Karen. That was incredibly illuminating, and thank you to Baker, Christian, and Claudia for having me here. I took a slightly different tack than some of the other researchers. I looked less at domestic policy and domestic issues, and asked some questions about how the GCC states spend money abroad in terms of what we call ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, and in humanitarian aid. And the reason that I wanted to ask this question was to look at this two-way process of lessons learned abroad and lessons learned at home for these countries that have undergone phenomenal development over the last 50 years, in most cases, particularly in terms of their human development indicators, but have also become increasingly prominent in spending and working abroad. My primary expertise, or at least what I'm best known for, is the work that I do on Yemen. And one of the first trips I took to Sana'a was all the way back in 2009, when the Qatari government flew me to Sana'a to show off this major new real estate development project that they're involved in. And it was this $400 million project which towered over the city. that they thought the very rich people of Yemen were going to end up buying houses in. And the idea was they'd spend all this money building this real estate project, but at the same time they'd train Yemenis in modern construction and construction management techniques, and this would help create a new economy for Yemen and possibly over time allow Yemen to become integrated into the GCC with this more professionalized workforce than maybe GCC nationals would have expected from Yemenis. Now, the last time I was in Sana'a was at the end of 2015, and the real estate development project in the middle of Yemen is in the middle of a civil war. Is little more than a few blocks of concrete and some metal pylons sticking in the air. But it was my introduction to the approach of the GCC states to development in other countries, which was significantly different from what you and I might think of in terms of aid and development questions of capacity building. The Qataris did similar things in South Sudan, in northern Sudan, and many other places around the region. So they were trying to couple this Gulf investment in high-end real estate with sort of a more developmental approach. And we saw at the same time competition between all the Gulf states. But to just come back to another anecdote, in 2012, I remember traveling deep into the Tahama on the west coast of Yemen, going to some really, really remote rural communities. We're talking sort of dirt roads all the way, and getting to a tiny community which had a beautiful working water pump and well, and a very nice school. And that had been sponsored by a wealthy Saudi merchant in Saudi Arabia who had been hiring people from this village in the middle of nowhere in Yemen for the previous 25 years. And that really showed the other side of the way that the Gulf states have done development, have done aid spending abroad, which is these incredibly informal networks based on personal relations. And certainly in the deeper working paper that I wrote, I managed to get into that in more detail. But coming back to the policy paper, which you can find over there, the core point that I really try and bring forward is that historically, the OECD has been seen and has seen itself as what it calls the venue and voice of donor countries abroad. And what that means is we're the people who spend the most money, but also we're the people who do the most thinking about how to spend that money and how to get the most bang for our buck, both for the countries that we're spending them in and for us as donor nations. And what we've seen over, I'd say, the past decade or so is the emergence of the GCC states as visible donors abroad, which is not to mistake the emergence of visibility for spending. For a number of decades, we've seen sort of this competition almost among the Gulf states to talk about who spends the most money on humanitarian aid in particular. But it's really sort of the tsunami in East Asia about 15 years ago, when we really see sort of the emergence of the GCC states and their own aid agencies popping up, and they're not just talking about the money that they're spending abroad. And the GCC states becoming implementers who are watched with interest and caution by their Western partners, who at the time are still thinking about the effects of, let's say, Saudi, Kuwaiti charities in Europe that were later linked to extremist groups. So the question that I came to with this paper, really I'll break down to 4 questions. What are the lessons that the GCC states have learned at home and applied abroad, and what lessons have they learned abroad and applied at home? The second question is, has aid and development assistance translated, as has been the expectation for many Western states, to soft power and influence abroad? Has the image of the GCC states been improved by the money that they spent abroad? The other question is, what's the strategic agenda of spending from state to state? And obviously it varies from country to country. And finally, how do the GCC states see, Western partners see this spending, especially within the context of this fear of funding for radical, for extremist groups, for Salafi madrasas all over Europe, which continues to be, one, accounted for as aid spending by some Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, and two, is the cause for fear for a number of Gulf states. In terms of the lessons learned, what was really fascinating when I started asking these questions of people in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE in particular, was that the idea that the GCC states had anything to learn from working in development abroad was absurd. The GCC states had no connect to the countries that they were working from, and it would be incomprehensible to compare these countries to somewhere like Yemen, to somewhere like Syria, to somewhere like Sudan, despite the fact that sort of 50 years ago we're talking about comparable development indicators. There are no lessons to learn abroad. And when it comes to what lessons can you learn at home to be transferred abroad, it becomes a little more ad hoc, really. We're now seeing sort of people talking about a UAE model for the world, the Dubai model. When we saw the talk of a new capital city for Egypt, there was a lot of talk of how this was going to be sort of creating a Dubai-like model, the creation of free zones in Saudi Arabia, even to model themselves neon around Dubai. But in general, that's not a well thought through and strategized process. This isn't something where there is deep intellectual architecture. It's often based on the idea if we take this one model that's worked in this one place and transfer it to the other, then with a bit of luck, it'll work. Secondly, has aid and development assistance translated to international influence and soft power? There is a Saudi commentator who will remain unnamed, who shortly after the, how shall we call it, the issues around the location of Rafiq Hariri, made a public comment, sorry, not Rafiq, Saad Hariri, made a public comment along the lines of Saudi Arabia has spent billions in Lebanon and has got nothing back from it, so we can do as we please, in effect. And that, again, really speaks to an issue that I think a lot of people, and not just the Gulf states, are coming up against. The United Kingdom's Department for International Development is now being told that it has to demonstrate that the work it does abroad translates into economic growth for the United Kingdom. And what you've seen within the GCC is, if not a review, a reconsideration, particularly post-2011, of what influence and what stability in the region its aid brought it. Even within Egypt, there are stories, which some of you will know, of the UAE sending advisors to work in all of the key ministries in Egypt and removing them within around 12 to 18 months because they couldn't get any traction, despite the fact that they had billions on the line. The Egyptian civil servants and members of the military that they ended up working with were much more interested in maintaining the status quo than feeding money through the system, using a tender system that's closer to what we'd see in the UAE. And that really feeds into this question of strategic agendas beyond and broad thinking and strategy. And what we see here is a fairly evolutionary process, but we do see the GCC states thinking much more carefully, particularly since the Arab Spring, about how this money translates into them getting, in effect, what they want abroad, getting that bang for their buck. And again, this isn't a question that is unique to the GCC states after 2001. We saw this question of a whole-of-government approach in the United States. How do we link aid, how do we link security initiatives abroad to improve the national security of the United States? The example to come back to here for me is really one of Yemen, where we've seen the Saudis in particular become the major funder of UN-led and of their own humanitarian projects, and arguably crowding out other funders. We're in a moment where the UN, the World Bank, and others are in a period of unprecedented strain, thanks to Syria, thanks to Myanmar, thanks to Yemen, to these major humanitarian and developmental crises the world over. And when European countries are increasingly inward-looking, are increasingly looking to spend less abroad and to work within humanitarian crises within the region, i.e. refugee crises, so on and so forth, and when certain people are talking about building walls and all sorts of other fun things. So what we get to here is that the Saudis providing most of the funding that the United Nations requires for Yemen in particular, but in 2017, when the UN issues a report on the status of children in armed conflict and names Saudi Arabia on its blacklist of countries that are abusing the rights of children in armed conflict, a really strong threat to withdraw funding, not just for Yemen, but for all the humanitarian programs that it funds within the United Nations. Similarly, the creation at the beginning of the Yemen war of the King Salman Center for Humanitarian Relief, a lot of the money that was promised to the UN being handed to this center, and then UN agencies having to go and piecemeal receive their funding through fairly detailed agreements with the Saudis, where there have been broad accusations that they've attempted to make sure that most funding goes to the people who they're most interested in. Because the Saudi system, because the Qatari system, the Emirati system aren't particularly transparent, we also have this issue of these incredible figures being given for spending on Syria, spending on Yemen, so on and so forth, where we don't really know where the money is going. So we're seeing the instrumentalization and what was described to me as the transactionalism, this transactionalism within the way that people are using aid. So political agendas are being served. But then that's no different realistically from Western states. Obviously we saw the US pulling some money for UNRWA a few months ago when when the Palestinians tried to push things through the UN that they didn't like, and then within the past week removing all funding entirely. So it's important to have that context that when I bring this critique forward, it has to be seen in the context of they're doing nothing different than anyone else. But at the same time, these things do threaten the infrastructure of the international humanitarian, the international aid system. And we do have to think about this long and hard. And this really comes back to this question of how the GCC states, Western partners, see them and how they approach them. And what we see is that, for better or for worse, the OECD countries have gone through multiple cycles of trying to learn from their experiences with aid. They've tried to think about what does work and what does not work, and they've gone through cycles of this sort of intellectualization of aid, and that has worked in some cases and it has not worked in other. And we also, as we move towards a process of discussion around reconstruction in the region, or not reconstruction itself, seeing these same states looking to the Gulf states, looking to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait in particular, to fund a lot of the reconstruction within the region. What's worrying is that the concerns and criticisms that are being raised over, say, the way that Saudi Arabia approaches Yemen are really not filtering into policy thinking, to my mind at least, on reconstruction in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, so on, so forth. And this is a real policy conundrum that we're going to end up talking about a lot, I think, in the next 1, 2, 3 years. Christian had waved a 5-minute warning at me here, so I think I'll leave it there with the problem rather than any solutions. Thanks very much.
So the short-term priority is job creation for young people. And so some governments, Oman, Saudi Arabia, are saying, okay, foreigners out, we're going to save those jobs for Saudis. But saving a $10 an hour job in a mobile phone store for a 30-year-old Saudi is not going to generate productivity for the Saudi economy. It's not going to generate, long-term growth. So an alternate perspective that I think the UAE has done is to say, okay, we welcome foreigners, and they're, much smaller country, much smaller domestic citizen population. So they have more flexibility in this regard, granted. Especially if you are a well-educated person, if you're going to bring money with you and you want to start a new business, come, welcome. And especially if that technology is transferable and you can teach and train our young people too, then you're welcome. The question, and it's been like that in the UAE for a long time, the question now is that reliable? So if the government promises you a 10-year residency or permanent residency, if you start to say something on Twitter, how quickly will that change? All right? So it's not. I think we'll go through some learning curve there. But in the general sense, some states are taking a more long-term view towards foreigners and their value to building a productive and dynamic economy. And other states are saying, I need to make sure I'm providing stability and giving someone the option to say, yes, I have a job, I am employed, which basically means that's keeping that person from being angry and potentially mobilizing in the street. So very, very different timelines, I would say. The number for Peter, I don't know, what's it, $8 billion the Saudis have committed to Yemen?
They say more.
They say, what's actually delivered is different.
Yeah. So one of the issues we often come to is there are all these big numbers floating around, but then drilling in and breaking them down into this is how this was spent and where can be very, very difficult, and getting an understanding of accounting practices can be different. And then when we bring in things like individual donors who don't really have to self-report that much, giving money to build a well or a school somewhere like Yemen, that creates another layer of complexity. So while I understand the point, and a lot of people have brought some wonderful presentations with wonderful numbers in, there is a quite specific reason why I tend to actually stray away from numbers somewhat in the work that I've been doing on this, and I should have been clearer on that, so thank you for the question.
The comments piece is really very good.
Karen, can you comment on the issue of the GCC tax reform that had been in the making for several years and then somehow was supposed to be started, at least in some of the GCC countries, in 2018, but it's gone quiet now. Also, what is the impact of now oil at about 78, close to 80 now, dollars a barrel going to have in terms of this plan going forward?
Yeah, great question. So the value-added tax was introduced in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait on January 1st of this year. Bahrain promises to introduce it in January 2019. It was meant to be all GCC states at the same time, and then there were some problems. We did see the introduction of a white land tax in Saudi Arabia, which was very important, mostly land held by members of the royal family in urban areas that were not developing it and jacking up prices of commercial development by making less land available. So yeah, oil prices. I just read an HSBC projection for 2019, oil at over 80, by 2020 at $85 a barrel. So we are headed back to high oil. This is because a lot of the spare inventory that was sitting out in tankers has been used up now. And we've had, Iran coming offline in November, problems in Venezuela, problems in Libya. So spare capacity is, or spare supply is now kind of gone. There's not a lot of room for the ramping up which President Trump requested of the Saudis. So we're going to see higher oil, no question. Does that dampen the reform momentum? Absolutely. But at the same time, I mean, a country like Bahrain, their break-even price is over $100 a barrel. For the UAE and Kuwait, it's more in the 60s. For Saudi Arabia, a bit higher. So you can't continue to spend this way, even with oil at $85 a barrel. And a number that I would love, if any of you are familiar, the monthly military expenditure in Yemen. I mean, I've seen 10-digit figures from Saudi Arabia, and it's impossible to know.
And I think the oil price collapse gave the window of opportunity to push through some of those increases that Karen has talked about. Of course, that window is going to be as palatable if citizens think, well, oil prices are now higher. Why should we continue to take the pain? So I think that some of the measures in 2014-15 could be pushed through because people realised it was a moment of crisis. But that urgency, I think, is now dissipated. Very much more difficult.
Can I ask something? Yeah. Peter, the issue of assistance to Yemen from the GCC countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. I mean, in the past, they've done things like, big deposit to the central bank, into the social welfare funds, the small business funds. But depending upon how the government formation goes and what role the Houthis might play, how do you foresee this as having an impact on how Saudi Arabia in particular, and possibly the UAE, look at the issue of assistance?
I mean, a really interesting example is the central bank of Yemen. So in August 2016, Hadi, the president, announced that the central bank of Yemen was being moved from, the headquarters being moved from Sana'a to Aden. Yeah. And in effect, they created an entirely new central bank in Aden and tried to bring as much of the data as they could from the north. But they didn't have access to any of their international banks. So in effect, it was being used to distribute money that was being printed in Russia and paid for by Saudi Arabia. But one of the carrots on the stick that the UAE and Saudi Arabia had used to convince their Western partners that basically shutting one central bank down and creating a new one was a good idea, was this argument that we're going to give them billions of dollars. And it was only at the beginning of this year, August 2016 to January 2018, when we saw an announcement that money would be given. And the last time I checked, which was 3 weeks ago, of the $2 billion that has been given and is in fact held in escrow in accounts in Saudi Arabia, no funds have actually been dispersed yet. So we end up in this place where there are political and there are other reasons why this money filters through the system so quickly. And I come back a lot of the time to this issue of crowding out, where policymakers in Washington, policymakers in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and elsewhere, here, Saudi Arabia has given them $2 billion, and at the very senior level, it's very difficult for them to get their head around the idea that they should be giving lots of money as well. So it's a dual issue. One of the announcement, a lack of follow-up, political and logistical issues, and capacity in Yemen is a huge problem, will be for the foreseeable future. Who are these people who are going to implement things to the level that the Saudis and Emiratis want, and then the crowding out of other funding. And if you end up with a unity government which involves the Houthis and others, that's going to be an even bigger bottleneck and an even bigger issue. Yeah.
Maybe one last question, sir?
Yes, just the address to Dr. Young. The other side of the fiscal policy, of course, is the current account and balance of payment of these countries, which must have improved somewhat as the oil prices have gone up, but I think Saudi Arabia still is probably near deficit, its current account. And it's pegged, the currency is pegged to the dollar. So do you think the borrowing of $11 billion has to do with the defending the exchange rate? Because I saw somewhere that they had something close to $60 billion outflows of private capital last year.
$150 billion.
Wow.
Yeah. No, this is a PIF specifically, so it's meant to be used for outward investment placement. So it's not going to the current account at all. But there are other states, particularly Bahrain, which does face a challenge in defending the peg, for sure.
On that note, I'd like to thank the panelists. Lunch is behind us, and the afternoon tea is at 1:35.